Hi, I'm Thomas Broadhead. I'm the editor of the Critical Performance edition of the Ives Fourth Symphony. And in this video, we're going to talk about the quarter tone piano part and a very funny thing that happened in one of the early rehearsals of the new edition. Now, in the old 1965 score, there's a quarter tone piano part that's indicated. And unfortunately, it gives the impression that all you need is a piano that's been tuned off by a quarter tone. And typically what was done in the past was a player was given this weird looking part and they would sit down at this piano that had been tuned off by a quarter tone and they were expected to produce all the notes that are in the part. But it doesn't work that way. Ives isn't writing just for notes that are set off by a quarter tone. He's writing for a mixture of regular tones and quarter tones to be coming out of the very same instrument with intricate filigree patterns noodling around those quarter tones and regular tones. So in the past, this part was rarely done right at all. And so it needed to be handled specially, and this issue had to be corrected. Everything had to be clarified and made, easy to execute in the new edition. So without further ado, here we go. Okay, so here's an example of the music written for the quarter tone piano. Never mind the fact that the notation is in the orchestra piano part. We'll get to that in a minute. What's perhaps unique to the quarter tone notation is that Ives used square-shaped notes. To give credit where credit is due, it was actually Hermann Langinger, the engraver of the 1929 publication of this movement, who devised the square-shaped notes. But Ives approved them for the engraving, and they were subsequently retained in the 1965 edition. So they're unique to the score and perhaps a bit famous because of it. So they've been retained in this edition with the additional tweak of adding an arrowed accidental, as you see here, so it's doubly clear that the pitch is a quarter tone and not a regular tone. But where are the regular tones? Well, they appear as normal elliptical notes. So here on the right hand, you'll see occasional D natural regular tones preceded by a D natural quarter tone and the filigree pattern. It's true that almost all the notes on the right hand are quarter tones, but it's not true for the left hand. The left hand is executing a noodling triplet pattern where it's alternating between quarter tones and regular tones, like that. So you couldn't play this part on an instrument that was simply shifted off by a quarter tone. You need to have a dedicated instrument that provides access to all the notes required by the part. Now, Ives was an organist, so he was accustomed to playing instruments with two or more manuals. So he likely imagined a double manualed keyboard instrument with one manual for regular tones and the other for quarter tones. And in fact, he did correspond with a piano maker about having such an instrument built, but that never came to fruition. However, he was likely thinking of something like this. This is a photo of the instrument that Ives likely had in mind, or something very similar to it for the quarter tone piano part in the symphony. This instrument actually has three manuals. The closest manual to the player is just regular tones. The one in the middle is quarter tones, and the one above it in the rear is regular tones again, to facilitate difficult passages, allowing you to go back and forth with your fingerings as the passage demands. But I think Ives probably just had two manuals in mind. Several quarter tone pianos have been made, but there was none available to Ives at the time. And because of the lack of clarity in the previous score, most conductors and players in the past were unaware of what Ives was desiring for the part. Michael Tilson Thomas used two stacked electronic keyboards for his recording of the Ives Fourth with the Chicago Symphony in 1989. That's approaching the solution, but it requires two players to staff the instrument, each one covering a single hand. That makes a unified, fluid realization of the part difficult, and it requires yet another keyboard player. It's also not an acoustic solution, so there really has to be a simpler way of doing it. And there is a scordatura piano, meaning a specially mistuned piano that would be played normally, but would produce all the quarter tones and regular tones required for the part. And the player would simply play a standard-looking part with no square-shaped notes at all, just regular-looking notes. But the notes would be mapped to the desired pitches of Ives's part, both the quarter tones and the regular tones. And so the music intended for the part would be produced when the part is played on the specially tuned instrument. Now, scordatura is normally associated with string instruments, especially violins. Famously, a scordatura violin is used in the second movement of Mahler's Fourth Symphony. But when I thought of a scordatura tuning of a piano, I wasn't sure if it had been done before for any other piece, or even if it were possible. Perhaps making the task easier was that Ives didn't call for all the notes and the cracks of the 88 keys of a standard piano. The quarter tone piano part in the symphony doesn't make use of all 88 times 2 notes. It only applies a small subset of them. So then the question became this: is it possible to tune a piano specially to account for only the pitches that are required for the part? To facilitate that, I made a digest of all the notes needed for the part, both quarter tones and regular tones. Armed with that, I looked for a skilled piano tuner, and I found one in Nashville who had specialization in historical tunings, Edward Foote, who's well known and very well respected in the tuning community. I showed Edward the score and the digest of the pitches being targeted, and then asked him, is it possible to tune a grand piano, a baby grand, or an upright to get all these tones without loosening the strings to the point that they lose their timbre or tightening them so much that they snap? This qualification is very important. The piano needs to sound good with the tuning applied to it, and the piano doesn't need to be in danger of being damaged by the tuning. He was intrigued, and so we spent an afternoon together, and eventually he concluded that it was, in fact, possible to do. He worked out a tuning scheme and then assured me that it would work on every kind of piano: upright, baby grand, full grand, concert grand. So now let's turn to the tuning chart. And here it is, provided in the front of the quarter tone piano part itself. It works by notating keys on the piano on the top staff of each system. On the staff below are the resulting pitches that should be produced when those keys are depressed, with the difference of the change provided between the staves and cents, thus showing between what's written on the part, on the top staff, and what's produced on the bottom staff. So here, for example, if you play this B natural, out comes a B natural quarter tone. That seems like an obvious mapping because the key and the pitch are so close to each other. But the proximity of the key to the sounding pitch is not always so close. Let's look at the bass clef. Here at the start of the staff, a G natural produces a quarter tone F sharp, but over here, a regular F sharp produces a C that's a tritone away from it. All of this in the bass clef is necessary for the triplet noodling that's taking place in the left hand in the Beulah-Land section, where the left hand noodles around regular tones and quarter tones. This is what made working out the tuning so difficult and exacting. Now, Edward Foote, the tuner, then insisted that the chart be presented twice, once for tuners who read music, and then a second time, like this, for tuners who do not read music. I was astonished there would be a concern like this. But then he said, well, there are many absolutely fine tuners out there who do not read music, and I'm one of them. I was blown away. I said, really? And he said, yeah, I don't read music. This really shocked me because his house was full of pianos, including a piano that was well-tempered, and he had spoken with me at length about Beethoven earlier. But he proceeded to play some music to show his skill. And I was like, seriously? I still wonder if he was pulling my leg about his own music reading abilities, and had simply said that to make a point to me about the necessity of including a version of the chart that did not require the tuner to read notation. But he helped the Ives Symphony incredibly with this, so my gratitude still runs deep. Now, everywhere I went, I checked with the staff piano tuner to find out if Edward Foote's tuning scheme actually worked. He assured me that it would work on a baby grand, a full grand, or an upright. And I did see both uprights and baby grands being used for the part. I'm happy to report that everywhere I went, the tuner told me, yes, it works perfectly. And the tuner at the Berlin Philharmonic even told me that it was fun to do because it was so out of the ordinary. I always asked them if the tuning was safe for all pianos, and they always said that it was. One tuner, though, caught a mistake in the written-out version of the tuning chart, the version for tuners who don't read music. He explained that he did read music himself, but he cross-checked the two charts and found the mistake, one that I had made while setting that version of the chart. I never would have caught that error had I not been present to interview that tuner. Again, this proves the value of being present and interacting with all the people who come together to mount a performance of the symphony. Okay, so that's great. We have a tuning chart. But what does the player see? Let's take a look. Here's that filigree part that we looked at earlier, here realized for the scordatura piano. Gone are all the square-shaped notes with the arrowed accidentals, and in their place are just regular-looking notes, notes that largely don't seem to correspond to the pitches Ives wrote in the original form of the part. But all the player of this part has to do is play it as indicated, and out of the instrument will come the pitches that Ives desired. The player doesn't have to worry about anything other than just playing the music. Importantly, this allows for expressivity that could not be achieved if the part were being executed by two players playing two stacked electronic instruments trying to coordinate the complicated filigree patterns. Now, speaking of electronic keyboards, I should point out that, of course, the scordatura tuning could be applied to an electronic instrument as well. If desired, you could tune one according to that tuning chart, and it would work just fine. But you wouldn't be getting the authentic sound of an acoustic piano, right? So using an actual acoustic piano is desirable. And almost everywhere I went, an acoustic piano was used, either with an upright or a baby grand, and it worked fine each time. One side note, in this passage, I'm cueing the solo violin playing the Beulah melody, because the quarter tone piano here is accompanying the violin solo, and it makes it easier for the players to coordinate. Players explained this to me at the Lucerne Festival, and so I added in subsequently, and it's helped players ever since. Okay, now, the next question. Who plays this part? You could have a dedicated player for this part who plays nothing else in the symphony, but it could be performed by a tag team of the organist and the secondo orchestral piano player, who each would take turns playing the instrument. Let's take a look at this. Here's the part for the four-handed orchestra piano part. It's where you traditionally find the player who would be staffing the quarter tone piano. That player would move back and forth between the orchestra piano and the quarter tone piano. Now, there has to be a place in the parts somewhere that shows the original notation of the quarter tone part, showing the actual resulting pitches. So it might as well be in the orchestra piano part, since one of its players will likely staff the quarter tone piano at least part of the time. The presence of the quarter tone piano notation in the orchestra piano part would also function as a cue to those players that one of them may need to move to that instrument to play it for the indicated passage. So here's an example of this from the beginning of the second movement. And here are the quarter tone notes that are to be produced by the quarter tone instrument I drew a box around the notation to ensure that it's clear and that it's not being played on the orchestra piano. So that's fine. In this passage, you could, in fact, have one of the two players move over to the quarter tone instrument to play those pitches. And that would work here. But if either of the orchestra piano players does this, that player would run into problems later on in the movement. Just before we get to the Beulah section, both the primo and the secondo orchestra piano players are playing in the measure right before it, right before measure 217, when the filigree quarter tone piano part begins. So one of the two players would have to get up and abandon the music that's being played in that lead-up measure. And then again, just after finishing the filigree passage, both orchestra piano players come in just after the downbeat in the very fast passage that follows the Beulah section. This is disappointing because the quarter tone piano sounds again in the fourth movement when only one orchestra piano player is playing in a passage when the organ is also playing. But wait a minute, the organist isn't playing until the third movement. So it's possible that if there is a clear path between the quarter tone piano and the organ console, one that could be negotiated without any trouble, provided all the other players on stage, and then if the timing is right, whoever is playing organ could be sitting at the quarter tone piano and play it during the second movement. After they're finished playing the filigree part in the Beulah section, they could just move off stage quietly while the pandemonium is going on in the passage that follows, and then get to the organ console in time to play the third movement. This is especially possible because the organ doesn't enter until about halfway through the third movement, so there's ample time, even if the player can't move until the second movement is over. Then, in the fourth movement, the secondo orchestra piano player could, in fact, cover the quarter tone part. So it all works out logistically when you have that kind of division of labor for the part. So before we get to the incredible and funny story, let me reiterate. The quarter tone notation is provided in its original form in the orchestra piano part, functioning as a cue of sorts that the quarter tone piano must be played during those passages, perhaps by one of the orchestra piano players. Initially, I labeled it like this, and I thought, well, this should be sufficient, right? Well, I went beyond that. I tried to explain it in the material at the beginning of the part. Now we're getting dangerously close to the point where I can relate the story. It's about a mistake a player made reading the instructions that required me to revise them in a way I never anticipated, and no one would believe me that the revision is necessary unless they hear the story. It's also necessary so that no one ever makes the mistake again. Continuing the review, though, here's what the quarter tone piano part looks like. Of course, it's for scordatura piano. To let tuners know where to find the tuning instructions, it says on the front cover, contains tuning instructions for scordatura keyboard. Following that is a broad explanation of this curious part, titled The Nature and the Tuning of the Part, and explains that the music mixes quarter tones and regular tones, and by that clarifies why a scordatura tuning is necessary. Then it goes into the logistics of how the part could be played. It could be executed by a dedicated player, or the organist and the secondo player could trade off time at the instrument. All right, wonderful. Following that, the tuning instructions are provided. And then, finally, we get to the part itself, which includes standard cues of other instruments in the symphony. Incidentally, the old 1965 parts had no cues for any of the parts. I'm still amazed that anyone could play the piece from the old materials. Getting back to the story, though, here's what the player reads from, as we've seen before. For clarity, it always states that it's a scordatura tuning to remind the player that if they hear funny notes coming out of the instrument as they're playing the keys, when they're expecting different pitches to be produced, that it's expected. This would definitely be an issue for a player with perfect pitch, right? It's always there to remind them. Okay, now let's look at the orchestra piano part. In the beginning, it's both the primo and secondo players playing. Then, wherever the quarter tone piano is to be played, the resulting quarter tone music is presented with square-shaped notes, and always in boxes. This serves as a signal that at least one of the players, either the secondo player or the organist, must move to that instrument and play its part. All right, great. I thought this would be perfectly clear, and then the funniest thing happened. I won't say at which orchestra it happened because, in retrospect, it's understandable, but just barely. During the first rehearsal of the second movement, the secondo player got up and moved to the quarter tone piano, but then he began playing the scordatura instrument using this part, the orchestra piano part, not the scordatura piano part. None of the right notes came out of the instrument, of course. The conductor caught it and stopped the rehearsal and said to him, Wait, what are you playing here? The pianist then answered by playing this music that's found in the orchestra piano part on the scordatura piano. And of course, out came the wrong notes, the wrong pitches. The conductor had a very sharp ear because he caught it. He was baffled, and the player didn't know what to do, and the player just kept going on, and then they just rehearsed the movement like that. Now, I could see a copy of the scordatura part on top of the specially tuned scordatura piano right there for that player. It was right there for him to use when he moved to the instrument, but he didn't use it. He was reading from the orchestra piano part. Why did he do that? So during the break in the rehearsal, I rushed down to speak with him to find out the source of the confusion. So I said to him, Why are you playing from the orchestra piano part? And he said, Well, that's what I'm supposed to play, am I not? Here's the notation, right? I then said, Well, yeah, but look, here's the scordatura piano part right here on top of the instrument. He looked confused and then pointed at the cover of the part and said, Yeah, I saw that, but it says on the cover that it contains the tuning instructions for the scordatura keyboard. I then said, Yes, it does, as well as the music to be played on the scordatura keyboard. Then he looked at me and said, Oh, so there's actually music inside of this part book, not just tuning instructions? I said, Yes, it's not just the tuning instructions. It has the music itself. And then I opened the part and showed it to him. He then said, Oh, okay, well, I'll just play that for now. Thanks. So how could I hate to use this expression, but how could I idiot-proof the part? Because I thought it would be perfectly clear that the part labeled for the scordatura piano would contain the music for the scordatura piano, but apparently not. If I hadn't been present to clear the confusion, the scordatura part wouldn't have been played during the rehearsals and the concerts. So I had to revise the cover of the part. It now says, contains tuning instructions for scordatura keyboard, as well as the part to be played on the scordatura keyboard, which is an incredible redundancy, but it was necessary. Then I had to do something to the orchestra piano part so that it would be clear as well. Wherever the quarter tone notation is present in that part, there had to be a signal that, yes, somebody needed to be at the scordatura piano to produce those pitches, and yes, it would likely be one of the orchestra piano players. So I had to add this text to guard against misinterpretation. play on quarter tone piano using separate scordatura part, and also resulting pitches shown here, written above. And I went further to add a footnote to ensure it was understood. These and other similarly boxed notations are to be played on the scordatura quarter tone piano using the separate quarter tone piano part named quarter tone piano scordatura. Consult orchestra librarian for clarification and ensure the separate part is being used for these passages. Had I not been present when this orchestra had this breakdown, where the player misunderstood what was in a part based on one line of text on its cover, a line of text that's essential so that whoever handles the part can alert the tuner to attend to the tuning, I never would have known that it could be misinterpreted this way. And there's no telling when this might have happened again. So this is a very funny example of why it was so worthwhile for me to be present at the rehearsals. It allowed me to catch these misunderstandings and clarify the material so that there would not be confusion for the players down the road. You know, players come to an orchestra rehearsal on Tuesday morning for a concert they're going to play on Thursday evening, and typically they just sit down and play whatever's on the stand in front of them. They're almost never confronted by a piece of this complexity. So sometimes you have to over-explain things so that everything will work out just fine. So that's the strange scordatura piano saga and the unexpectedly funny thing that happened with it early on.